What's up, everybody, and welcome to the 90s First Podcasting Network. My name is Mike, and alongside my co-host Joe, we take a look at some 90s content that we just can't stop watching. Join us on our flagship show, the 90s First Show. We look at some 90s content that Joe and I are watching, as well as some current stuff, and we end it with a 90s trivia contest. Or join us on Test Your Might, a video game debate show where we battle it out on the current news. Joe hosts as our good buddy Cicero and I try to get the high ground and go 1000 IQ against each other. If you would like to connect with us, we are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at the 90s First. And finally, if you would like to support us monetarily, we have a Patreon. Head on over to patreon.com/the90sfirst to show general support for as little as $1 a month. So whether you're listening to the 90s First Show or Test Your Might, Joe and I would like to thank you from the bottom of our hearts. We hope that you have a blessed day. What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the 90s First Show, where we take a deep dive into some 90s content that we can't stop watching. And in this case, that we can't stop reading. So, my name is Mike, and today we have a very special guest. We have our buddy. He's been on the show before. You guys know him as a comic expert, Star Trek expert. It's our buddy Chris Clow. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing well, Mike. How are you?
Oh, good. Good. Excited to record this episode with you. Like, guys, we're doing Batman stuff, and again, Chris Clow, he knows his stuff. So definitely look forward to the rest of the episode. Let's do some housekeeping really quick. We were supposed to have another buddy on, Justin, who, if you listened to our last Test Your Might episode, he was on there. He's actually a permanent part of 90s First now, so just wanted to reiterate that. We miss him tonight. He had some family things going on, but Justin's really excited to be joining the team. He's going to be really helping to be a third chair on the 90s First Show specifically, as well as help us with like more consistent social media uploads and stuff like that, to be a little more present on our socials, because me and Jelly, we're just not the best at it. So he's going to help us out on that. And then as well, another episode of Test Your Might is going to be coming up next week. Justin will be battling Cicero while I host, so definitely take a look at that. So got some good things cooking for Test Your Might, but we're here for 90s First. Chris, that's all the housekeeping I had. We want to know, who are you? Just remind our audience and let us know what you've been up to recently. How you been, man?
I'm doing well, thank you. Well, by day, I'm a business reporter, and by night, I obsessively read comics and play video games, and the stuff that I think is cool, I like to talk about. And also a big Star Trek fan. You guys should know Cicero pretty well by now, and Cicero is one of the hosts of my Star Trek podcast, Discovery Debrief, which started just as a Star Trek Discovery podcast, but as more and more current Star Trek shows have been rolling out on Paramount Plus, we've just kind of talked about everything that they've been rolling out now for the past couple of years. And right now we're in the middle of season 2 of Star Trek Lower Decks, the animated series, which is a lot of fun. And we're starting to get together on a relatively regular basis. Like, we'll try and pack a couple episodes into one discussion on Discovery Debrief for Lower Decks, because they're only half-hour shows. So we like to bank them a little bit. But yeah, you can find Discovery Debrief, a Star Trek podcast. Before we started recording, Mike and I were talking about my comic book video game podcast, Comics on Consoles, that I got to do some more content on pretty soon, because it's just a passion project and I have to find the time to feed the passion. But that's a show that's a lot of fun, and I'm planning on doing more there. And yeah, you can find perspectives of mine on all sorts of things just on Twitter at Chris Clow.
Well, there you go. Follow him. Listeners, we'll have all of those links down in the show notes, just to let you know where Chris Clow is at. I'm sorry, Chris. There's some names that I cannot say without the last name, and yours is one of them. I'm just saying, like, Chris Clow just kind of flows.
There are so many Chris's, though, too, that I also look, any chance to stand out, I'll take. So don't worry about it.
You always stand out. You always stand out, my friend. Well, anyway, we're going to get into our discussion here today, listeners. And as you guys know, I know it's been a while for an episode for the 90s First Show, but just a reminder, we do take a look at some 90s content that Joe and I have been watching. Today, we're going to be doing a specific episode on something that both Chris and I read. He's read multiple times, obviously, because one of his favorite comic book arcs in Batman. But also, we do a 90s Now review, which is a 90s piece of intellectual property that has been brought to the future, basically. So our 90s Now review will be on a movie adaptation of said comic book. So, Chris, I'm going to utilize your thoughts here already, right off the start. We are talking about Batman The Long Halloween, which is, again, a comic book arc from the 90s. Can you just give us an overview, non-spoiler, of what The Long Halloween kind of is in the comic book, in the graphic novel as well, you know, if you read it all in one sitting there. No spoilers, and then after you describe it, we'll give a spoiler warning, and then we'll just dive deep into it. So go ahead, my man.
Sure. Yeah, so really, in terms of the original story, the best way that I can think of to describe The Long Halloween is basically like the definitive version of Batman's second year as Batman. He is still operating largely as kind of an urban legend on the streets of Gotham. He is not particularly very experienced when it comes to where we pick up with him in this story, and Gotham City at large is still pretty well owned by organized crime. The really interesting thing about The Long Halloween, and chances are if you know Batman, you know the kinds of regular villains he interacts with, Long Halloween starts to show the transition of Gotham City being owned by mobsters and organized crime to quote-unquote the freaks, or super criminals, and why supercrime was able to kind of supplant the underworld power structure in Gotham City. And it also kind of tells the story of how Batman's partnership with legitimate authorities in Gotham becomes more solid. So in Batman Year One, which in the comics is still pretty canonical for this story, Batman and Gordon were able to kind of feel each other out and understand that they could be allies that could work together to accomplish something in an extreme environment. And The Long Halloween really takes that a step further and brings in a third element to the partnership between Batman and Gordon in the crusading district attorney of Gotham, Harvey Dent. And Harvey himself is a major focus of The Long Halloween. If you know the future of Gotham, then you might know where Harvey's story goes. But if you don't, The Long Halloween proves to be a very pivotal moment in Gotham City's history, not just in the development of Batman as a force for good, but also in the development of the forces of evil and how they escalate over the course of the full story. So it's really the kind of war that Batman trained for against quote-unquote typical crime, but it is a really deeply running murder mystery, and it puts a lot of his skills to the test and is one of the things that helps him to realize that he needs to step his game up in the years to come. Yeah,
I mean, I will automatically say that I would not have done that any better. So thank you for that summation there. Listeners, this is your official spoiler warning. If you do want to go back and read The Long Halloween, or also as we go into the movies later on that were just adapted from the graphic novel, the comic series in general, this is your spoiler warning. So we're going to dive deep into it. And just to let you know, personally, this is probably one of my favorite Batman arcs that I've ever read now. So as my comic book journey has, begun, and is still continuing. So definitely go check it out. I definitely recommend it. But again, spoiler warning here. If you want to put them on pause, go to your local library, grab the graphic novel, because you're probably going to be hard pressed to find the single issues. but definitely check it out and read it, as well as check out Batman the Long Halloween, the movies, as well. There is a part 1 and part 2, so definitely check those out. But spoiler warning, that is it. So all right, Chris, let's kind of dive deep into this. I'm going to start us off like you kind of hit on it. I love these Batman like gangster stories. I really do. Like they're some of my favorites, like Carmine Falcone, the Maroni family, like all of those types of stories that you see in the Batman universe. Like they're some of my favorites. So let's hit on that a little bit. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, you are certainly not alone in feeling that way. I think that it's pretty fair to say that a pretty sizable portion of devoted Batman fandom generally prefers the stories that take place where Batman works alone and where he's kind of in the early years of his career, kind of where we're seeing the movie that's coming out next year going to. And really, at least the first 2 Christopher Nolan films, The Long Halloween is a direct inspiration to the Nolan films. In fact, if you are fortunate enough, like I am, to have the Absolute Edition of Batman the Long Halloween, then you can read an introduction that's sort of like a conversation between Christopher Nolan and David Goyer about this story. And so the inspiration to larger Batman media is very apparent. And it's easy to see why. I mean, Batman facing off against a form of crime that is far more recognizable to us in the real world. Mm-hmm. People like to apply concepts of realism to Batman, and it's totally understandable why. The value that I personally find in a story and in conflicts like those is that it really is Bruce Wayne and Batman in his comfort zone. And what I mean by that is, his parents are murdered. He spends years traveling the world, gaining the skills necessary to wage a war on crime. And this is the kind of crime that he knew that he was going to fight. But the thing that I also like about what the super criminals represent when they start to assert themselves more forcefully in Gotham is that they really kind of push him out of his comfort zone. He's not used to operating against these very, very extreme personalities. He probably thought that he would have to take on eccentric people like Carmine Falcone and Sal Maroni, but when it comes to minds like the Riddler and the Penguin and the Joker in particular, they take him to a whole other level. Yeah. And really, when it comes to 4 key early years Batman stories that I recommend to everybody, this is among them, but this is really like the third one that I would recommend, because year 1 is probably my all-time favorite Batman story. Got an Absolute Edition of that as well over on the shelf. And then in 2005, a writer named Ed Brubaker, who you might know as the original writer of the comic book story of Captain America the Winter Soldier, he had a pretty long run on Batman, and he decided to write a story called The Man Who Laughs that takes place immediately after year 1 and kind of modernizes the story of Batman's first meeting with the Joker. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And then I would go to Long Halloween, because Joker is already an established presence in Long Halloween. And then Long Halloween also had a direct sequel that involved a lot of the fallout from this story, but it also introduces Dick Grayson into the mix. And I love that story too. Yeah. But the charming thing, to your point, about these kinds of early years Batman stories that deal with organized crime is that it's recognizable to us, and although it's in Batman's comfort zone, these mobsters have no idea how to deal with Batman, and that's cool to see. And it's fun to see these people who have been in positions of power for so long just get totally blindsided by this force of nature that is Batman.
And I think to your point there, like, I I think it's crucial that if you do plan on reading this, listeners, like you have to go in with that mindset that this is his early years. Like as I'm reading The Long Halloween, I come to realize that as you read it, you're like, if this is prime Batman, like if this is Batman, like facing off, as you said, like against the Riddler, against like Joker, and in the nitty gritty of that, I don't think The Long Halloween lasts as long as it does, right? Or maybe like half a year or something like that, because it lasts a full year. It lasts Halloween to Halloween. And I don't know if Batman in his later years, a little bit more experienced, as you were saying, that he's not in this, it lasts this long, which is why it's such a cool and compelling story, because you're reading Batman's growth in that. And like, and as you were saying as well, super criminals are like, the freaks, as you said, are like introduced in such brilliant and cool ways that Batman has to figure out and navigate. All right, I'm trying to solve this like Falcone murder mystery, and yet I have to deal with all these guys as well.
Yeah, and I mean, it really kind of gives credence. There's a lot of creators that have run with the idea in the comics that and even in other exploitations of Batman, like there's a few episodes of the animated series that focus on the concept that supercrime is something that wouldn't exist in Gotham if Batman hadn't been there. And this story kind of runs with that, but at the same time, too, a lot of the major super criminals that make themselves known over the course of The Long Halloween, you shudder to think of what they would be able to do if Batman was not around. And that creates a dynamic as well, because over the course of this story, you are seeing traditional crime try to hold on to the power that it has left, even though this completely other kind of force is coming to supplant them. And it's a point of transition for Gotham City, and it's really when you start to go from the quote-unquote old Gotham into what we largely understand the Gotham City of the DC universe to be.
And then, again, to elaborate on what you just said, like, that transition is also pretty apparent with like Carmine and Falcone, right? Because he even enlists some of these super criminals to kind of help him get ahead, help, kind of like do his business, even though his family is getting murdered, on the next subsequent holiday, right? He's trying to transition into this period. He understands that these super criminals are going to have some influence on Gotham City, and so he also utilizes that in The Long Halloween. Yeah,
well, Falcone is really the representation of that old Gotham. He's the representation of the way things used to be. I mean, there's a reason why you see flashbacks of Falcone's first meeting with a young Bruce Wayne, but you also see that he's used to being in control, and he's been in control of the underworld for so long that he just assumes when these super criminals show up, they're pawns for him to use as he pleases, and that they will be deferential to the long-standing power that he had. But in the end, Falcone is not prepared for someone like the Joker to come into the fold, or as we know, if we're into the spoiler part of the conversation, Two-Face, who's really kind of a more vicious representation of what supercrime can be for Batman. And that's a position he maintains really throughout most of his modern stories. But Falcone just isn't prepared for that, and he pays the price for it.
Yeah, completely agree. So let's start at the beginning. Each holiday, there is a murder in the Falcone family, and list the suspects, like right at the start. Like, who are the suspects, really?
Oh, they're relatively typical. They're people within the underworld of Gotham City, and they're really trying to figure out. It seems, at least at first, like there's some kind of war between the families, and because that's naturally what it would be if certain members of a particular crime family are turning up dead. Suspects number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 are going to be whoever the other opposing family is. It's really, at the beginning of Long Halloween, it very much feels like an episode of The Sopranos,
or
and
like
then by the end of the
movie, right?
Or like like The Godfather, and by the end of it, it's Batman. You know, it's a Batman story with Batman characters, and it's one of the cool things that you observe over the course of in the book, the 13 issues, that you see that full evolution.
Yeah, and then like you see some also things like folding where like you add Dent to the mix of like suspects, because he's pretty adamant at getting the Falcones. Like he's the DA. He wants them off the streets. He wants them to stop running Gotham, and then Batman, Gordon, and Dent kind of take this pact to like get them all down, to take care of them. And then these bodies keep like showing up, and Dent's pretty vocal about it. And so he becomes one of the biggest suspects.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, Falcone chooses to respond to this in an interesting way. And really, so do Batman and Dent in choosing to not only forge their own partnership, but when they kind of go off on their own without Gordon and come across a warehouse full of money, what do they decide to do with it? And it's just one of the ways that Dent is starting to understand, too, because it's a pivotal moment of understanding for him.
Yeah.
And it's something that, unbeknownst to Batman, is going to feed Two-Face later on, is the necessity that Batman feels he has to have to operate outside of the law. And Dent, of course, as the highest recognized law enforcement officer in Gotham, it's kind of antithetical to the way that he operates, but he's also open to it because he recognizes the extreme threat that Falcone and the crime families represent. And he is so committed to taking out the organized crime element of Gotham City that you start to see just components of his obsession.
Yeah.
And it's an obsession that will ultimately undo him.
Yeah, and like just really quickly, I think this is one of the better like iterations of Dent's like, origin story into becoming Two-Face, because there's been some different ones throughout the years, and I think this is one of the best because, as you reiterated, as you said, having Dent like continue this path of realizing that, as you said, like he might have to do some things outside the law in order to get these guys who function so well within the law, it seems, but they're breaking the laws left and right. Like he comes to the realize that there is kind of a bad side to him, like, and that's what's really, 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 really cool about this, and just like the push that the Batman has on Dent as well. Like it's a really, really cool story. Let's backtrack a little bit. Catwoman, she is, she's kind of an integral thread into the comics, even right at the start, and obviously we'll get to the movies. Movies changes her story a little bit in that regard. But what do you think about Catwoman in this? The listeners, if you read the book, there's a pretty weird image of Catwoman, like maybe like page like 6 or 7 or something like that. That's a little awkward, but Catwoman, what do you like about her in Long Halloween? So
I like that this story gives her a little bit more of a reason for being and a reason for getting more involved. And it also kind of explains why she has a predisposition to criminality. But also, it emphasizes that she has enough of a moral compass that when something is very wrong, she recognizes that she can do something about it.
Yeah.
So it really does kind of emphasize everything that she's supposed to bring to a Batman story, in that, she's very much like a cat walking on the edge of a fence. She could go one way or she could go another way. You're not totally sure where she's going to end up. But chances are that even though she's largely led by a large degree of self-interest, there is a little bit of selflessness that creeps into some of her actions, and it's Batman that brings that out of her.
No. And like I would venture to say that in the comics she's a little bit more on the villain side, the way they write her, because even at the end, like she's kind of with that group of supervillains at the end. I mean, maybe she's a little incognito, just like, I'm gonna kind of, like you said, I'm gonna kind of do what I want and what I see is kind of right, but I think she's a little bit more villainous in the book, and in relation to the movie. I don't know. I've always liked Catwoman as a character, and I don't know if I told you this in like our messages, but I recently just finished the Tom King run of Batman, like one of the more recent runs, and Catwoman is very prominent in that, and I really enjoy that story too. So it's kind of cool seeing the difference of how Catwoman is portrayed in all the media that I've been reading and watching recently. So the Falcones, they're getting murdered one by one on each Halloween, and Batman, like as we were saying, he's kind of like not as experienced, so he's checking in with Calendar Man like every so often, which is kind of funny because like ultimately Calendar Man doesn't necessarily help like at all, but like Batman in his almost naivety like doesn't like feels like Calendar Man is a significant role in this story and understanding what's happening with this crime. What are your thoughts on that, Wrinkle?
Well, in general, I think the purpose that Calendar Man serves here is kind of an intermediate stepping stone, because Julian Day is very much an eccentric personality, but at the same time, but he's also not as extreme as other people are going to be. So he helps to provide a clear stepping stone to the kind of crime that will become dominant in Gotham. But he's not really capable of breaking out into like a larger threat level like a Joker or a Two-Face. Or, well, Riddler's a bad example in this story, but
is Riddler even in the comic?
Yes.
Blank. Oh, yes.
Briefly.
Yeah.
He was almost one of the victims of Holiday, but wasn't at the last second.
That is right. I am remembering that now. Because that was on April Fool's. Now I'm remembering. So
yeah, exactly. So, but Calendar Man, he's interesting enough that I think he's good at bringing a reader's attention into the focus. And he, by adding that wrinkle, like you said, into the larger plot involving Holiday and really this war that breaks out between the Falcones and the Maronis, it adds just enough of a recognizable component of supercrime without ceding any power to the traditional criminals. And I think that's largely the purpose that he serves.
Let's hit on Bruce Wayne. Like obviously there's no Batman story without what's going on in this billionaire philanthropist's life, right? So Bruce Wayne, he runs into Poison Ivy a little bit. Maybe you could touch on that. He's also working pretty closely against Carmine Falcone in that sense. Like Bruce Wayne is pretty pivotal to this story as well. Let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, he feels, I think his feelings on Falcone thinks that they should be on friendlier terms, considering
family.
That there was a moment in which Falcone was badly wounded when he was a younger man, and took advantage of the fact that Dr. Thomas Wayne was going to help him without necessarily going to the proper authorities. And Falcone, for all of the, I guess, circumstance that he tries to put forward as a member of Gotham High Society, that's where he thinks not only that, okay, so Bruce's father saved my life, but also we're both long-standing families in Gotham, so there's got to be some camaraderie there. But he doesn't know how committed Bruce Wayne is to the eradication of crime in Gotham. And Bruce is obviously a smart guy, so he knows everything that he needs to know about Falcone in order to make a proper determination about him. For Batman himself, and I say Batman because really that's who Bruce knows he is inside his own head. He has a little bit of a different relationship with his identity in this story because he's still kind of under the impression that maybe he can also be a little more crusading without having his mask on than he will largely be later on. So even though he's working a lot behind the scenes, he's still a bit more of a philanthropic presence in Gotham. And really in quote-unquote modern-day Batman stories, Bruce Wayne is a philanthropist, but he really publicly tries to push forward this vision of a buffoon and a playboy and someone who couldn't possibly, be Batman to throw people off of his scent. But at this point, he's still, I say idealistic, although that doesn't quite feel right. He has not developed that delineation as much between Bruce Wayne and Batman. So he is a little bit more out front as Bruce Wayne than he will be in the future. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it kind of gets him into trouble.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it just kind of as Bruce Wayne kind of gets too close to the ultimate conflict, and that's, as you said, gets himself in trouble.
But at the same time too, I mean, we shouldn't ascribe Bruce's desire to do good with the thing that totally gets him into trouble, because Falcone really wants to use him. Yeah. And that's ultimately the thing that sets one of the freaks onto Bruce Wayne. So, I mean, Falcone is fully responsible for that, as well as the villain he employs. But that is kind of it retroactively became a lesson that Bruce Wayne learns later. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is so cool, just like in the comics to see, especially recently reading this Tom King run, just to see the growth of Bruce Wayne as I could kind of be Bruce outside of Batman a little bit. But ultimately I am one and the same, but I still want some piece of Bruce to be around. Pretty interesting.
Yeah.
So much to talk about in this comic alone. Let's talk about the antagonist, right? Holiday. At the start, you're kind of with Batman, you're kind of with Dent. You really don't know. You're kind of with Gordon as well. You really don't know who this Holiday is supposed to be. Who, you kind of got some suspects. Dent comes into the fold in that. Obviously, as we've already talked about, other families like the Maronis are in there as well. You just really don't get a grasp of it until Batman sees one of Falcone's sons as a potential suspect as well. So that would be
person of interest.
Yeah, person of interest. That would be Alberto Falcone, right? And this is where, and we'll get into this a little bit. This is actually probably the biggest difference between the movies and the comics. So talk about Alberto Falcone here for a little bit as kind of a character that comes into the fold here.
Yeah, he comes across really as kind of the Fredo of the Falcones, Yeah. But he ends up becoming a pretty shrewd operator, even though he's probably largely an accessory. His last name gives him a lot of credence to be used as a pawn by some of the other people that we know ultimately do, use him.
Yeah.
And it ultimately leads him, of course, to accepting at least legal responsibility for a large degree of the killings, but we know a little bit better. And Alberto Falcone he really kind of represents the death knell of organized crime as we know it in Gotham. Because with his father kind of out of the picture, and with the conceivable weight of legacy of the Falcone family pretty much falling to him, but now also not because of the legal trouble that he finds himself in, there's a power vacuum in the underworld that is ultimately filled by the freaks, the people that his father thought that he would be able to control, and which he was very, very mistaken with. So Alberto, I mean, he's got more agency than Fredo, but at the same time too, he is a little bit of a slightly more shrewd quasi buffoon, considering that it was really his machinations that led to the downfall of organized crime in Gotham.
Which is really, man, just you saying that like harkens back to what we talked about with Two-Face, right? He just like Two-Face just kind of bridges the gap between that kind of like organized crime to that like super freak crime, you know, like yeah. He is kind of the culmination of the law and chaos together, and that's really what I see in that picture. I don't know if you agree with that. You could tell me I'm wrong. That's fine.
No, I'm not. Look, the nice thing about these stories is that there's a fair amount of ambiguity in the way that some of the original stories are told. So yeah. I'm not going to tell you that you're wrong. It's just, it's a matter of perspective, and that's kind of one of the things that makes it fun.
True. So I'm wrong. I hear you. Oh man. Anyway. So yeah, what's next here? We talked about, Alberto Falcone. Let's get into the nitty gritty so that we could potentially move on to the movies. Gilda and Harvey Dent. The Dents, they kind of are the silver lining of this whole story. And so let's touch on Gilda a little bit, and see where that conversation leads.
She is, she seems so much like kind of a wallflower for most of this story. And really the way that the book ends with her is kind of a swerve, considering, the fact that she's kind of been window dressing for a great portion of the story, but at the same time, she obviously has served as a major point of inspiration and a desire to rid Gotham of crime from her husband.
Yeah.
But she also obviously proves that there's a little more than meets the eye, and her perspective is not all that different conceptually from the triumvirate that this story mostly follows in Batman, Gordon, and Dent, but it's askew enough that it makes a pretty big difference in the way that she decides to go about things.
Yeah.
And in a way, she benefits very directly from the rampancy that supercrime takes up over the course of this story, and people don't suspect much.
No, even Batman himself, like, I mean, he shows up at the very end of the story in Gilda Dent's basement, where she is burning basically evidence to the crimes that she has committed. And Batman, like, and we'll talk about this in the movies as well, just like Batman kind of, in a sense, like, Gilda, you've gone through a lot. Your husband literally just became a supervillain. You kind of helped usher that into happening. Like, do you agree with Batman's response here? What are your thoughts on that?
It's hard for me to disagree with Batman on anything, just because he's got his eye largely toward a focus on stability.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the potential larger stability for Gotham, I can see his perspective, but might have made a different decision. But this is also, you also have to take into account too that this is a younger Batman.
Yeah.
And even though I think that it is incorrect to characterize Batman as a cynic, he is less idealistic as he is older. I still think that Batman is an idealist. That's one of his best kept secrets. But in this case, it's open to interpretation.
The comic expert himself. I think that's what's so interesting about this story is that, like, it at the end, in my opinion, it shows the growth of Batman in this sense that he is able to weigh the pros and cons of dealing with the actual culprit. Because Gilda's mission was to get Harvey back. And ultimately, Harvey's true passion was to stop the Falcones. They are stopped now. And so I feel like Batman kind of weighs that pro. Like, is Gilda really going to do anything more? Like, I think he weighs that pros and cons there and realizes that no, I don't think Gilda is really going to do anything more because she's lost everything. I mean, who knows? Maybe, but I mean, that's kind of where I saw Batman kind of leave it be, which is pretty interesting.
Well, you have to also square it with some of the other characterizations that we do see from him later, and ultimately these are interpretations which are reserved for the writer who is primarily taking on, you know, whatever the stories are trying to say. Mm-hmm. So Batman, his general perspective in terms of whether or not Gilda is a threat that is neutralized, I think that he sees it really as a form of mercy that he's trying to show her.
Yeah, I hear you.
That being said, in the future, if Batman were confronted by someone who is proven to be as dangerous as Gilda is, because how many bodies has she left behind?
Yeah. I mean, that's also up to interpretation.
True, yeah, I guess so. But I mean, really, at the end of the day, considering what she did admit to, mm-hmm. I think she's probably proved that she is a pretty dangerous person. And had she encountered Batman later, he might not have been so forgiving.
Yeah, mm-hmm. I 100% agree with that. It's very hard seeing Batman as a merciful character because ultimately he doesn't show that too often, as you've kind of alluded to. Because I totally agree. Gilda, like in a future Batman story, no, Batman's not going to let this person run around. I mean, she theoretically killed every single person, and so I guess what's your thoughts on that? Do you think, like, how many murders did Alberto have? Do you think Dent was like Harvey Dent was even involved in any of them? Like, what are your thoughts on that? Besides, obviously, Dent does kill the final Falcone, right? He does put mm-hmm. 2 bullets in Carmine's head. So, I mean, what do you got on that?
My personal read on it has been that The Long Halloween would be just as apt with the title of The Tragedy of Harvey Dent, and that I don't really think that he was as involved as he would grow to become as Two-Face. And part of that is because, you know, this is a fall from grace. This is a guy who really was perhaps the third greatest hope of Gotham that has become one of its most persistent nightmares.
Yeah.
So I tend to give Harvey the benefit of the doubt because I think the story is also a little bit more potent by showing that he wasn't as in control of his ultimate fate as as other people were, which is kind of the thing that makes it a little bit more tragic in my mind.
Dude, couldn't have said it better. Like, I completely 100% agree. Like, and it just shows, like, just, I mean, men, if you're listening, like, pay attention to your wives. I mean,
well, and
that's just a joke, sorry.
But it also, in terms of Gilda too, like, confessing to Batman is an innovation that the movie makes.
Yeah.
Because, you know, in the book, she kind of gets away scot-free.
Yeah.
Because Batman isn't as able to see the forest for the trees when it comes to what she wants to do and what she is really committed to doing. I prefer the book's ending because the decision that the movie calls for Batman to have made when confronting Gilda as she's confessing, to me, is a little out of character.
Yeah.
I don't think he would give her... Like, granted, we did talk about how this is a less experienced Batman. Perhaps he does see this as a component of mercy. But really, when it comes to the war that he's committed himself to, I think it makes more thematic sense to go with the book's ending as my preferred version. Just because it in a way, it almost makes the arrival of Two-Face more senseless.
Yeah.
And more avoidable. Mm-hmm. Because, you know, after watching the movie, you might be forgiven if you went, well, if Batman just figured out that it was Gilda earlier, then he could have saved everybody. But by Gilda getting away, very much like for the majority of history, Joe Chill having gotten away with killing the Waynes, there's a lack of control that Batman has over the situation. Yeah. And it's one of the things that informs the Batman of the comics in the future, that he's not able to control every component of crime in Gotham. He wants to be. He wants to be on every street corner at the same time, all the time. Yeah. He wants to be able to prevent what happened to him from happening to anyone else ever again. But he can't. And there's a degree of, even as well prepared as he is, and even as much as he wants to be the solution to the persistent cancer of crime that rampantly runs through Gotham, he just can't be.
Yeah.
And by Gilda getting away with murder, effectively, you illustrate Batman's real true enemy, which is not the Joker, it's not Two-Face, it is the randomness of crime.
Yeah. Because
Batman himself was a victim of random crime.
Yeah, it's crazy when you have such, like, you have a Batman story that does include the Joker, that does eventually include Two-Face. It does include all these supervillains, and yet the one who is actually doing it is just the wife of Harvey Dent. Like, she's not this, like, A-list character or anything like that. But that's what makes the story so compelling, is because throughout your read of it, you never really suspect Gilda. Like, you just never really suspect it. And that's what...
And neither does he.
And yeah, and neither does Batman. And that's kind of what makes it so brilliant, as you were saying, is it puts you in Batman's shoes, and you don't expect that randomness that you were saying.
And by the movie changing that kind of pivotal component of it, I'm going to say this, it's going to sound like I'm being a bitter fanboy about it. I really don't feel as strongly as what I'm about to say might think that it might indicate.
Yeah.
But it does slightly weaken Batman's position in the story. And it gives a little bit more credence to the idea that he is potentially making a bad decision. With the way that the book ends, by not having that be a component of Batman's decision-making at all, to me, it's thematically stronger because it serves as kind of a rededication that Batman has to eradicating crime. And ultimately, the thing that The Long Halloween does is gives him enough of a desire to become a better detective. And really, you see the consequences of that in Dark Victory, in the direct sequel to this book. Mm-hmm. But that rubbed me a little bit the wrong way. I see what they were trying to do, as I think I explained, in terms of where Batman is at this point in his career and what decision he's really trying to make. And I think that is open to interpretation. Mm-hmm. But since we have seen where the book ends and we can compare it to the movie, I think the book just leaves you with a better taste in your mouth.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, in the movie's defense, and we'll get to a little bit more into the movie here in a second. In the movie's defense, like, you know, Hollywood just does like to, you know, wrap that bow up, right? And I think the way that the movie does is less ambiguous, and it does wrap kind of a little bit more of a clean bow on it. Because they're not going to, you know, be doing this. I mean, maybe they do a sequel, you know, to this. Who knows? But whatever. Let's get it. Let's do some high level comic stuff. What do you like the art style in this?
I love it.
Yeah,
I love. Tim Sale. I've had the fortune of meeting him a few times. He's a very generous creator with his time. On its face, you might think that, like, I think if you bring like 10 books to him or 5 books to him, he'll sign like the first 5 for free, but then he asks for $1 for each additional book. And you're like, well, that's but he donates those dollars to a charity that I really love called the Hero Initiative, that is devoted to paying outstanding bills, largely medical bills, from comics creators who have fallen on hard times. And I think that that's a really good illustration of the kind of guy Tim Sale is. Yeah. But beyond the kind of guy he is, his art style is really deceptive because on its face it looks really simple. But then when it comes to the details, like there's that really early page where Batman and Catwoman are like nose to nose almost. And the detail that he applies to the line work in the shadow really gives his work a lot of definition. And the emotion that he's able to imbue his characters, particularly with their expressions, I think he's phenomenal. He and Jeph Loeb, who's the writer of this story, whenever they work together, and they've worked together several times on Batman stories, on a really great Superman story, and on a series of themed color Marvel stories, it's always memorable when they get together. Yeah. And this is absolutely no exception.
I love the look of Batman in this comic. Like, just the tethered cape a little bit, just the longer ears, the colors, like, it's absolutely brilliant. Obviously for the movie, they modernized some of the looks, which I think works. But ultimately, like, this art style, I enjoy. I gotta tell you, cause it's kind of funny. Jelly was reading the comic, and I was on the phone with him as he was reading, and he's like, "What? I didn't know Michael Jackson was in this comic." And right, like maybe 10, 15 pages in, you get this image of Selena Kyle, and she kind of looks like, with slightly longer hair, like Michael Jackson. I just like looked at it, I was like, that's kind of, it's close. It's close, but hopefully we're not dissing you too much here, Tim Sale, but it's kind of funny, his reaction to that.
Well, if you're not used to it, then it can strike you as his style is very stylized. Yeah, you know, it is very uniquely his. But really, when you get right down to it, the thing that you want your stories to be imbued with, you want it to be imbued with a sense of character, and you want it to be imbued with a sense of emotion, ultimately. And I think that Sale is really good at imbuing his stories with both of those things, because a Tim Sale book is a recognizably Tim Sale book. Oh yeah. And the fact that he's able to put as much effort and energy into all the characters' emotions, like the way that he renders this part of the face, like the brow, and the eyes, you know, like the eyes tell a story. That's kind of a long-standing cliche at this point, but it's a cliche because it's true. And he puts a lot of time and energy into helping the reader understand what the characters are feeling and why they're feeling it.
Yeah.
And Loeb accentuates all of that in a way that that just makes the words in the artwork in a harmony that that you want any good comic book to have. And it's one of the reasons why I'm not as keen on the movie, because you cannot replicate Tim Sale's art style and animation. It just cannot be feasibly done. And when I think of The Long Halloween, a big portion of my mind goes to the artwork of Tim Sale and the character that he brings to it. And so I think you do lose something by not trying to replicate that a little bit more, the same way that you lost a big degree of I think the character of Hush. When you that animated film, obviously Jim Lee is not an artist that can be mimicked in animation.
Yeah.
But he brings a great deal of bombast and spectacle to a story that doesn't really have it when viewed through the lens of traditional animation. Mm-hmm. So then you get into a debate of mediums, of animation versus sequential art storytelling like you have in comics. And everybody has their own individual preferences. But when it comes to this story specifically, I find the reading experience more powerful than the watching experience, personally. But that doesn't mean that other people can't think differently.
But you're wrong if you do. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Well, I think that's a good enough segue into our movies. So, listeners, I dropped it. Listeners, there are two movies that are about like hour 15, hour 30-ish long to cover this whole story. And so I guess let's kind of start with part one. I mean, we're just going to do it as a whole kind of, but let's talk about that style, that art style of the animated. Like, so for me, I don't know if I liked it necessarily in the sense that like it's bad in comparison to the book. Like, I don't know if that's where I go to. But more so like the way that they animated it almost was like a paper flip book, kind of like just the way that each scene moved along. It almost looked like it was just a series of pictures that they put all together. And I don't know if I necessarily like that versus like kind of like a fully motioned animated film. It was a little bit stop motion. Did you notice that, or was that just me?
No, I think that's a valid take on it. It wasn't as, I guess, smooth fluid, as some other animated movies. Yeah, like the frame rate might have. I mean, granted, it's animation, so you're gonna run into generally 24 individual images to make up a single frame, right? But yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with you. I think that's one of the things that they try stylistically to use to give the movie a little bit of character, like making it a little rough around the edges, maybe like a 70s crime drama kind of a thing. Yeah. It did have like a quasi gritty quality to it. So, I mean, it's fine for what they decided to do. Look, you're never going to be able to replicate the art style of the original pages in animation. It's just not feasibly possible. Yeah. Unless you give Tim Sale a lot of time and a lot of money, right? like 20 years and $20 million, maybe. But no, I mean, considering I say the word limitation a little bit loosely because animation you can do so many different things with, but obviously, you have to remain consistent in the general art style that you use, and it lends itself well to the format. But yeah, I mean, it did kind of have a little bit of a jerky quality to it. Yeah, and so that's certainly a nitpick. It's still, listeners, it's still watchable. But it's just something that it didn't put me off from not watching the movie, but it was just a little nitpick of mine. Since it is a movie, we could talk about voice cast. So let's do that really quickly. Listeners, we'll get into the story changes a little bit here a little bit later. Let's just kind of nitpick our, what the movie does. So like voice acting.
I don't know if it was you, or if it was just me, rather. But Jensen Ackles like kind of took me out of Batman. Like I don't know if I liked his portrayal of Bruce Wayne and Batman. So like, what are your thoughts on him? Like, I don't think he did a really bad job, but it's just like it wasn't the best Batman that I've heard, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was fine, but really, when it comes to a vocal performance for Batman, you're always going to be measured by the definitive example.
Kevin Conroy.
And Mr. Ackles, for the effort that he put into it, does not quite meet that standard.
Yeah.
That's not his fault. That's just the vocal cords that he was born with. He got the job for a very particular reason. But really, a lot of the very, very solid examples of voice acting in DC Comics animation really comes down to, at least in my opinion, voice director Andrea Romano, who was with Batman the Animated Series on up through a lot of the animated movies up until I think about 5 or 6 years ago when she retired. And she had the brilliant perspective of hiring people who, what she called, had voices with character as opposed to people doing character voices. So you hire someone based on the individual traits of their natural speaking voice as opposed to a quote-unquote traditional voice actor who can throw their voice in a bunch of different directions.
Sorry to interrupt, but like, are you talking about like, are you hinting at like Troy Baker specifically? Because like, or as like an example?
No. Because really Troy Baker is the example. It's funny because when you bring up Troy Baker, what I automatically go to is Arkham Origins, right?
Yeah, me too.
Because because Troy Baker, it was weird because Arkham Origins demonstrated, which for those of you who don't know, it's a prequel game released between Arkham City and Arkham Knight that takes place around the same time The Long Halloween does in Batman's career, and was in no small part influenced by this story. But you had a different voice actor for Batman and the Joker in Arkham Origins compared to the previous games, but very different philosophies because Roger Craig Smith, who voiced Batman in Arkham Origins, was very much doing his own thing, whereas Troy Baker was very much doing a mimic of Mark Hamill.
Yes, exactly.
And in the animated series, Mark Hamill's Joker is really kind of the exception to Andrea Romano's rule because Hamill was doing a voice, but it was enough of a natural voice and a consistent performance that now it is understandably and deservedly legendary in terms of portrayals of the Joker. Mm-hmm. But when you get into other cast members for the Long Halloween movie, I think you do fall into the trap more of people doing character voices. And I think Mr. Ackles is a bit of an example of that. He is very much putting on a Batman voice. Not that Kevin Conroy wasn't putting on a voice, but he was taking it down as opposed to pushing it up.
Yeah.
You know? Does that make sense?
No, yeah.
And really the best Batman voice actors, in my estimation, are the ones who dive deeper as opposed to jumping higher, you know, or who try to put significantly more energy into a character who is better served by going to that deeper, more intimate, personal place.
Yeah.
That sounds like Batman to me. Not the, not that he did that a lot through this movie, but he did it enough that it was similarly distracting to me.
I thought Josh Duhamel did a really good job on Harvey Dent. Like at the start, like it wasn't hitting with me, but then like when he started becoming Two-Face, like I kind of liked his growly, like a little voice there for Two-Face. What do you think about him?
Yeah, well, he went down.
Yeah.
You know, like he there's such a I guess a predisposition for performers in animation. It doesn't matter if it's animation that's meant primarily for adults or for animation that's meant primarily for children, to put on a cartoon voice, you know? And in a way, his Harvey Dent was understandably more animated. And I think that he kind of got the idea of I guess, the dichotomy, right? I mean, Two-Face is dichotomy personified. And by going deeper, you understand that Two-Face is a darker character, so your voice should probably go darker too.
Yeah.
In a weird way, I felt like Ackles and Duhamel should have been switched, but
yeah, almost. I kind of hear you on that. I could see it. I could see it for sure. Like we discussed, Troy Baker did Joker. Sorry, you were going to say something?
Well, I mean, Duhamel has experience, right? We know that he's done voiceovers and other things, and he's done voiceovers in video games as well. Mm-hmm. There's not an abundance of difference between the two. At least I would imagine anyway. I've never done video game voice acting, but I would imagine that the act of going into a voice booth and giving a performance is not going to be abundantly different in a movie than it would be in a video game, except for maybe the time that you devote to it. Mm-hmm. But no, I generally liked Duhamel.
Yeah. Good stuff.
But I'm sorry, you were saying.
No, I was, you're good. You're good. Please interrupt me as many times. Naya Rivera did a very good Catwoman, Selena Kyle. I believe she has also passed away recently. Because
yes.
The 2 movies were dedicated to her. And she was a phenomenal Catwoman, I thought. So very good on her part. Mm-hmm. Definitely a very talented voice actor that the industry will surely miss. Some other Jack Quaid did Alberto Falcone. Titus Welliver did Carmine Falcone, and Carmine Falcone in the movie like almost stole the show for me. Like I loved his voice acting, like just brilliant in my opinion.
I mean, Falcone is a character that would be very easy to overact.
Yeah.
I kind of feel like he went up to the edge of that, but I don't think he crossed over it. Carmine Falcone is supposed to be kind of a big personality, considering how arrogant of a character he is. So it's understandable that arrogance would transfer over into the way that he speaks. So yeah, I was fine with it. Jack Quaid, you're never going to get me to say anything bad about Jack Quaid.
Right?
He's brilliant.
He's awesome.
He's brilliant as Bradward Boimler in Star Trek Lower Decks. I'm confident he's going to be brilliant as Superman, and I liked him as Alberto Falcone.
Yeah. Also, in The Boys, watch that show. It was good.
All right, yeah.
So, all right, let's get into the story changes here. The overall main premise, listeners, does not change. Like, there's still a holiday killer. There's one person killed from the Falcone family. So that there's this holiday killer, and they need to figure out who is doing it, right? So that overall premise doesn't necessarily change, but there's little intricacies that they do take liberties on in changing. The one start was, I think Catwoman is a little bit more prominent even in this film. And let's talk about Catwoman's role a little bit. First, I want to touch on, again, just off of reading the Tom King recent run, and then obviously I'm going to start the new one here. I got the next 2 or 3 graphic novels on order at the library, so that's coming soon. Yeah. But Catwoman's love interest with Bruce Wayne specifically, she basically knows it's Bruce Wayne right from the get-go of this movie, and like they kind of bring that love interest a little bit more to the forefront in this movie, even though it wasn't too prominent in the book.
Yeah. I am personally not too crazy about the idea of too many people knowing who Batman is early on.
Yeah.
So Long Halloween is really interesting because Jeph Loeb, as a writer, features very, very prominently in DC Comics of the 1990s and the early 2000s. Hush, that he wrote and had Jim Lee as the artist on, takes place in quote-unquote the modern time period for Gotham, even though the story is now like 20 years old. But the then modern Gotham, where he's had three Robins by that point. Jason Todd has been killed. He's been well established as a force for good in Gotham. He's got relationships with characters in the Justice League. All of that stuff, the modern trappings of Batman that are absent in a story like The Long Halloween because he's so early on in his career in it. In Hush, that's the point in the comics of that time that you see Selina Kyle learn who Batman really is.
Yeah.
And by that point, it makes more sense. They've been through a lot together by that point. And it is a sign that Bruce chooses to give to her to demonstrate his trust. You know, he doesn't do that for everybody. One of my favorite moments in all of comics, really, is in Batman No Man's Land, when Batman has been gone for a long time. Gotham City has fallen into literal and figurative disrepair. Criminals have carved up different districts after Gotham was basically destroyed in a massive earthquake. And when he returns, Gordon is furious with him because where has he been all this time? Yeah. Where has he been to help out the police in trying to keep order on the streets that are left? And Batman takes his mask off in front of Gordon, and Gordon turns away. And he says, "Put it back on." And Batman tries to tell him, "This is all I have left to give you to demonstrate what your loyalty and friendship has meant to me." And Gordon just says, "Damn it, put it back on." And they come to a realization, and it's really a gesture that Batman gives to only the people that he trusts the most. Really, Gordon has earned that honor several times over, but I think both Batman and Gordon understand that there's a degree of plausible deniability if that wall technically exists between them, since Batman is technically a vigilante. So the fact that she knows who he is at this point, A, it doesn't jive with the original story, and B, it takes a little bit of the agency away from Batman himself in bringing her into the fold. I know that's kind of an over-explanation of a Batman fanboy, but...
Well, that's why we brought you on this episode, my man.
Right, yeah. So, I mean, I wasn't personally that crazy about it.
Yeah. I thought it was okay because I think bringing this story from the 90s into kind of what I would call the current run of Batman and kind of like the current, like Chris, like, even though I wasn't reading this run of Batman, the recent run of Batman at the time, like, Batman marrying Catwoman was a huge deal. Like, even outside, people who don't read comics, they were like, whoa, Batman's getting married to Catwoman, like, crazy. And so, like, I see the choice, and I kind of see why they made it, because it kind of modernizes the story. But I do agree with you in the sense that Batman's identity it is something that, like, in his second year, he did not willy-nilly give it away. In that sense, he was very, very well kept. I mean, Alfred knew. I mean, there weren't a lot of people who knew. And so for Catwoman to kind of know right off the start, that kind of shows a little,
it gives her, I mean, the movie tries to make her a more generally important component to the story, and I respect that. Yeah. But I mean, I read Batman stories for Batman. I don't read Batman stories for anybody else. And it did enough to take the choice out of his hands that I was just a little bit miffed by it. It's not like it's going to keep me up at night, right? But it's just like, you know. Oh,
we know you're laying in bed just like, I cannot.
Yeah, right.
And also they, in the movie, they, forgive me if I forget if this was in the book, but they wrote that Catwoman potentially was Carmine Falcone's daughter. in the movie.
I mean, it was a pretty major revelation in the book.
Oh yeah. Okay, that's what I remember, but I was forgetting a little bit. So that hint, they threw that in there. So yeah, but the big thing is that like at the end of the movie, you see Bruce coming down to answer the door for trick-or-treaters, and Selena Kyle's like right behind him. And so like that was just an interesting revelation that you found out in the movie. That was just like, I don't remember that in the book.
Yeah.
What are some other differences? What's a big difference? I mean, let's talk about Alberto Falcone, like completely different in the movie. Let's talk about that here really quick. And this is like the big kind of difference at the end of part 1.
Yeah, I mean, the movie makes him more generally conflicted. Mm-hmm. I mean, in the book, like I said, you know, he's kind of a Fredo, and all you really know about him is that Carmine sees him as the good boy, right? And he's largely stayed away from the family business. The movie tries to inject more personality into him. I don't remember the book making reference of him being fond of crossword puzzles, or giving him some like smaller human moments. And in the movie, it seems like he really wants to have his own life as opposed to proving himself to his father, which is understandable. And whether or not it does more service to the story, I think is debatable. Yeah. But there's nothing wrong with making him a more interesting character. Like maybe you can empathize with him a little bit more when he's caught in a difficult situation as the story goes on, but it's kind of just a change that doesn't end up changing the trajectory of the events very much. So it's fine, you know.
Yeah. So, you know, at the end of part 1, he does die. Like Holiday kills Alberto Falcone, and that doesn't happen in the book. You know, so that was a huge difference, because you had this idea in the book that maybe Alberto was kind of a suspect, but here Batman clearly thought that he had the motives, like Alberto obviously did. I mean, listen, his father was pissed when Alberto sent flowers to the Dent hospital room under Carmine Falcone's name, in fact. And so like the movie definitely plays a little bit more into showing just cause for Alberto to be the villain, and Batman, as we've discussed before, he's inexperienced, and so he kind of just automatically sees these evidences and like, that's him, that's my guy, I'm gonna go get him. And then on the yacht, you got on the scene the yacht, and Alberto Falcone, he dies from Holiday.
Well, and it also seems like they wanted to take advantage of the fact that they showed the funeral to lead into movie number 2. Yeah, you know, because I don't think that the funeral was depicted at all in the book. So they grabbed a thread from later in the story, applied it to this funeral scene as kind of a teaser for part 2, which is fine. But it really does get... I mean, the movies are by necessity going to have to streamline certain things from the book. Yeah. And I think this is just another example of that. It gets people to the end of the story a little bit quicker than you would get if you exhaustively adapted all 13 issues of the book.
So for the most part, with the Super Freaks, like, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have most of the same kind of like story beats with the super villains. Like Joker eventually gets in that plane, tries to gas up, you know, the New Year's Eve party and stuff like that. So that's still present in the movies. Poison Ivy still takes control of Bruce Wayne for several months, just like the book as well. So for the most part, I think like the supervillain stuff is kind of the same. I think we have some differences though with Dent, right? I mean,
well, there's, I mean, There's a couple of key differences. Like, part 2 has a relatively extensive hallucination scene with the Scarecrow that was not present in the book. Mm-hmm. And the movie also had way more of like a villain onslaught in the middle of Gotham City that was not really in the book at all.
Oh, yes.
But those are the kinds of changes that also are more understandable, I suppose. That in terms of the details of adapting the story, they don't make that much of a difference. But, moving it into a different medium, people have different sets of expectations for an animated movie than they would have in a comic book reading experience. So they added a little bit more of like spectacle to the story, which is fine. I mean, I'm generally a fan of what the Scarecrow can do with his fear toxin, so I liked that part of it. The rampage at the end I could take or leave, but it was fine. It
was fun. They do have to add some of that, just fun fan service stuff. Like you just got Batman and Catwoman fighting everybody for basically the life of Falcone.
And I was actually, now that I think of it, I was wrong. The book does not initially reveal that Falcone and Selina Kyle are related. I think that was actually a part of Dark Victory, the sequel. And even in that book, it's not explicit. She believes herself to be Falcone's daughter. Yeah. But the actual story does not take a firm position. But, I mean, who else are you going to believe about something like that? Okay, it's one of the few moments in those... Right, yeah, no, you were, yeah. No, it's one of the few moments where you feel like Selina Kyle is more of a reliable narrator than she otherwise normally is. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
All right. I pulled one over Chris Clow a little bit. All right. You got to give me that. I got to take some W's here.
Hey, take it, man. I give it willingly.
All right. Like I said, for the most part, listeners, the movie is not drastically a departure from, kind of like the overall narrative. But
this is... You're right. You are technically correct.
Okay.
And in Futurama, they say that's the best kind of correct. But it gets back to the difference between the reading and the watching experience, which I think is a big component of this. When I first read this story, I was, 14, I think, the first time I read this book. It was well after it came out. I was in middle school, I think, the first time I read it. During SSR time at school, I would read comic books. And much to my teacher's chagrin, proudly so. And this story just knocked me on my ass. And it still does. When I revisit this Absolute Edition that I have, nice oversized slipcased hardcover with archival quality printings, just like the best way you could enjoy that book when it's physically on your lap. There's such a maturity to the material in this story. And in a way, it's tempered by the reader coming up with their own voice cast in their head and putting their own cadence on the way that you move from one event to another. When those components are taken out of the reader's control and put into an animated environment, we talked a little bit about the perspectives that we have on the voice cast, not quite matching the seriousness, I guess, that I apply to Batman when I read this book, or even when it comes to like the lighting of certain scenes. You naturally have to go a little bit brighter than you need to in the book, because the book, if anything, is defined more by what you don't see because of Tim Sale's art style. And that's not the case in the movie. So, yes, you are correct in that plot-wise,
and that
the stories, right? Yeah, and I'm not aiming to take you to task or anything. It's just plot-wise, yes, the events are pretty close. But the actual experience of absorbing this, I'm always going to recommend that people read the book first. And I know that that is something that people say in general when it comes to movies that are adapted from any kind of book, whether it's a comic book or a prose book, or a pop-up book or whatever it is. You know, like the experience that you get from reading it, that is really what should come first, so that you can see how things are changed in the adaptive philosophy. Because chances are, you know, when you're reading a comic book, you have your own adaptive philosophy. You're the one who's putting together the seams between the frames or the panels of the pages, and you're putting the voice as it sounds in your head to the word balloons that you're reading in the book. The Joker will never sound more terrifying than he does in your own head. You know, Batman will never sound as harsh and brutal and brooding as he does than he does in your own head. So chances are, when those components are taken out of your hands and put into the hands of a director, a voice director, a series of animators, as talented as those people are, competing with your own imagination and the way that you put those images and words together, there's always going to be a disconnect. And it really makes the reading experience difficult to compete with, at least when it comes to my perspective. On one of my shows, The Comic Binge, we end every show by saying, read more comics. And that's why. Because one of the beauties of this medium, and it gets so... It's so criminally misunderstood, even now, even considering all of the ways that comics have advanced in society and the ways that people perceive comics as a medium to be. Even now, you have people who misunderstand the medium of comics as something that is somehow simplistic or unable to relay the same kinds of ideas as other forms of media, whether it's cinema or whether it's the written word itself. And that people who know comics know that that is not true. Comics is a medium. It is not a genre. It is a delivery mechanism to give you a story. And you can fill that picture up with whatever you want to fill it up with, as Neil Gaiman famously said one time. And that's why when you have a story like this that is so well beloved among so many people who love this character, you are rarely going to have a reading experience, or a watching experience, rather, that outdoes the reading experience. And to me, that's why movies like The Dark Knight, why Superman the movie, or Avengers Endgame, they are inspired by stories, but they are not direct adaptations of stories. So they're not competing with your reading experience.
Yeah.
They're remixing them and showing them in a new way, but they're not trying to, like, replace the story that came. Not that this movie's trying to replace the book. It never could, but you know what I mean? It's just like, by telling the same story, you know, you are then left with comparing the ways the stories are told.
Yeah.
And the best comic book movies in my mind are the ones that are inspired but not directly adapting previous stories. That was a rant. I'm sorry. I talked way too much.
You're good.
But
it's all good. Every time I read a line of Joker in comic, it is always Mark Hamill in my head. So I get
Troy Baker comes pretty close. I will say
Troy Baker has a little more depth to it, like tone wise, that is missing from Hamill's, which I like in Hamill's. It's a little more playful, but still completely senile and like just like completely psychotic as well. But yes, your analysis was correct. I was simply just talking plot, because I agree with you. I do overall prefer the comic, at least when it comes to this. Like, just knowing even the story beats of what the comic was, like it's just better in my opinion. But our overall villain, they add some wrinkles to Gilda specifically in the movie that shed, what they shed more light on the story, and so to speak, because it's not shed in the plot of the book. So first of all, she has a little bit of a relationship with Alberto, it seems. So do you want to kind of explain that?
Yeah, I mean, gosh, everything is really quite significantly changed in the end of this because, it ties into the claim that you saw Alberto make that that his father had taken away the only woman that he loved. So it caused this kind of festering resentment that Alberto would have for his dad. And we ultimately realize at the end of the movie that Gilda is Alberto's love and that they had met when they were in school, and she didn't approve of the relationship, and they actually got married, but there were these weird kinds of feelings of guilt, and Gilda actually had an abortion when she discovered that she was pregnant, and all of those things are what led Gilda to Gotham and ultimately to Harvey.
Yeah. Well, I think it was specifically that she had gotten pregnant out of wedlock, and Alberto said that
that's what he didn't approve of.
His family would not approve of that, nor did he.
Right.
So that kind of, as you were saying, that kind of set Gilda on this path that okay, if you're not going to love me for what has transpired in our relationship, we got pregnant out of wedlock, but whatever, you're supposed to do that. You're supposed to love me regardless. It ultimately came to Gilda getting to Harvey Dent, and ultimately kind of questioning her own reasoning for marrying Dent. It was kind of to get close to taking down the Falcone family. Ultimately, she did admit at the end of the movie that she eventually kind of fell in love with Harvey Dent and is actually going to miss him. That type of thing. Who knows?
Oh, that's thoughtful.
Yeah, very thoughtful. But that came at the expense of the movie, and ultimately the book does explore this a little bit, even in the ending, that Gilda, because of her being Holiday, was the ultimate reason that Dent kind of eventually became Two-Face, in a sense. So.
Yeah, I mean, really, though, when it comes to the application of a relationship between Gilda and Alberto, and all of those kinds of previous events feeding her desire to ultimately... It falls flat with me, largely because of something that I talked about when we started this conversation in terms of, tracing the randomness of crime. Yeah. Not every component of a story needs to be explained so exhaustively.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like they explained too much to the point of almost feeling like coincidence. And the fact that they're holding most of this to the end of the story doesn't do it a lot of favors.
Yeah.
So that's one of the reasons why I feel like the story in the book, especially when it comes to Gilda's involvement, which Batman never deduces, unlike the movie where he apparently did figure it out at a certain point. I get what they were trying to do in sort of creating a sense of symmetry overall in terms of the whole story, but I just don't agree with what they've added. And it feels to me like DC animated movies that have adapted these long-standing iconic stories have fallen far too much into a trap like this.
Yeah.
The last big example was The Killing Joke. They added an entire half to the beginning of that story that was not particularly well received, and with very good reason. And when they deviate too much from the greatness that is on the pages, I think you lose something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I did like that wrinkle that they were, they showed Batman's inexperience in that a little bit, with him just automatically thinking that Harvey was the one who went to that college. That same college as Alberto. So I kind of like that wrinkle a little bit, but I think you're right. Ultimately, it's almost a curse of over explaining versus letting, as you get in the comic book, letting the reader, letting the viewer discover things and try to interpret things themselves and really grasp and understand their own opinion about something that they've read or watched. I mean, that's the beauty of, like, let's say another Christopher Nolan film, like The Prestige, like, right? Like, that's the beauty of one of those films, that you get to kind of interpret what the ending is for yourself. Which is, you know, something that you were talking about really was that, like, what's brilliant about the book that the movie doesn't do is that the randomness of like Gilda being that is that you have a true criminal that comes up later in Batman stories that it is somewhat random, and that is the Joker, right? He is the ultimate random villain to Batman. Like, Batman doesn't necessarily understand why the Joker is doing the things that he does. It's just kind of random. It's the joke of it all, right?
Well, I mean, and one of the things crazy that I said before was that, you know, Batman's true enemy is random crime. Mm-hmm. Who embodies that more?
Yeah.
Why is the Joker constantly at the top of Batman's rogues gallery? Why is it the Joker who's seen as Batman's arch enemy? It's because of what he represents, and why Batman feels so personally devoted to trying to take the Joker down is because, in a lot of ways, he's the embodiment of the very thing that created Batman.
Yeah. And like all Batman discussions should, Joker should be the last. Anyway, Chris, we at the 90s First, we rate things on a scale of 1 to 5, but you have to choose something from the thing to be that 5. So, like, for example, you could do 5 jack-o'-lanterns or something like that from the comic book to rate it. So let's start with the comic. Out of 5, what are you giving it? You got to use something from the comic, though.
5 bat signals.
5 bat signals. Okay. I'm going to go 5 Tim Sale eyebrows out of 5. The Long Halloween is brilliant, listeners. I promise you, like, check your local library, order it, read it. It's a quick read, and it will blow, like Chris said earlier, it'll blow your socks off, basically. Now let's do just the movies as a whole, instead of rating each part. What do you got out of 5?
3 broken baby bottle nipples.
Oh, that's good. Oh, man. I like it. Dang it. That was a good one. I should have thought of that.
Bullet holes, you know?
With bullet holes. I'm going to go... I'm going to go 3.5 leprechauns, because there's a leprechaun on St. Patty's Day there. I thought the changes were a little more palatable than Chris, obviously, but I also it docks it the 1.5 for me because the comic is just way better.
Chris, it suffers by comparison.
Yes, true. Chris, any other final thoughts? First of all, once again, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure,
I've been texting you. You are the comic expert that I know of. So I needed to have you on this episode.
Well, I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about Batman. He is probably my favorite character in fiction in general. So, you know, this story, it really did hit me at really the right time when I was developing not just my perspectives on Batman as a character, but really my perspectives on the world, and the way that Batman sees things in such an analytical way is always something that has served as an inspiration to me. So I love this story to death. And really, anybody who has not read the original book, I would greatly encourage you, if for some reason you're listening to a full spoilerish discussion and you have not read the book, go out and do it, because and preferably do it before you see the movie if you fit into that circumstance. But even if you have only seen the movie and if not read the book, go back and read the book, because the book is just... it's the definitive version of a year 2 Batman story that you can get. And by that same token, Dark Victory, the direct sequel to The Long Halloween, is a definitive year 3.
And that, listeners, is what I'm reading next. All right. You could find Chris at Chris Clow on Twitter, and go follow all his stuff. His links will be down in the description, as well as follow at the 90s First. We're on all socials. Check us out there. Share out this episode. Leave us a review. We would love to hear from you, how we're doing, what we could do better, maybe what 90s content you want us to cover. Let us know. For Chris and for everybody here at the 90s First, my name is Mike. We love you. Have a good night. Bye.